Welcome to History for Granite. Join me to explore ancient Egypt. Please subscribe, and together we'll uncover secrets from the past written in stone. Of the many mysteries surrounding the most ancient pyramids of Egypt, the purpose of their various chambers is among the most curious. Many pyramids have a chamber with a sarcophagus, and this is a strong indicator about what kind of activity occurred there. But what about the other chambers, the ones that lie empty and silent without any artifact to point us towards understanding? Further confusion is created by the kings of the 4th Dynasty radically altering the chamber arrangement in each pyramid. How can we create a frame of reference when so many pyramid interiors look entirely different? And why might the ancient Egyptians be changing them so much at that time? In this video, we're going to compare salient features of each chamber in the Old Kingdom to give us a better context for what they might have been used for. Any chamber can seem bewildering in isolation, but many share characteristics that suggest a common functionality. Before sharing my personal perspective on this difficult subject, I'd like to contrast how Egyptologists have evaluated the chamber arrangement of Old Kingdom pyramids. For this purpose, I have selected a peer-reviewed paper from the Communications of the German Archaeological Institute of Cairo by renowned scholar Rainier Stadelmann. Stadelmann was director of that institute for 9 years and continued work on pyramids, including the Scan Pyramids mission, until he passed away in 2019. The paper is titled The Three-Chamber System of the Royal Tombs of the Early Dynastic and the Old Kingdom. The central idea is that every king's tomb in those periods was designed with 3 chambers, and that this requirement spanned 6 dynasties and nearly 1,000 years. Archaeology in early royal mastabas has since contradicted that portion of the analysis, so we will instead focus only on the pyramids themselves. But lest you think I've chosen a paper that is no longer relevant to Egyptology, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass praise it in their 2017 book, writing, quote, Stadelmann, however, documented a long tradition, found before and after Khufu, of a standard model of 3 chambers in Old Kingdom pyramids, and so other Egyptologists see the whole inner arrangement as a unified design, planned from the outset, and we agree. End quote. Indeed, Stadelmann believed that the strongest section of his idea was regarding the pyramids from the 4th Dynasty onwards, writing, quote, The 3 chambers are such a striking finding that it is truly surprising that this 3-room law has not been recognized long ago. End quote. My purpose for highlighting this paper is not simply to prove that Stadelmann is incorrect. Rather, it is to show how the pyramids are better understood as evolving rather than following a static and dogmatic formula. What is most astounding about Stadelmann's 3-chamber idea is that he never gives a reason why 3 chambers were required, not even a superficial connection to pyramid texts at the end of the Old Kingdom. The framework assumes every pyramid was designed with the same purpose, and thus a commonality such as 3 chambers must therefore be sacred. Evidently, a reason doesn't need conjuring for this type of analysis. Surely we can do better than that, so let's look at what Stadelmann has come up with. Starting with the earliest king's pyramid of Pharaoh Djoser, the categorizing of 3 chambers within it is highly dubious. The stepped pyramid is so distinct that I would be happy to give Stadelmann a free pass on this one, but the reasoning he provides frames later analysis, so we'll check it out anyway. The 3 chambers are designated as the granite box under the center of the pyramid, a now missing antechamber above it from where the granite box would have been plugged, and an array of adjacent magazines that were highly decorated. I'll wince at combining the magazines as one chamber, but they share a decorative motif, so we are already broadening our concept of a chamber. A chamber is now an area rather than a singular physical room. We can only extrapolate an antechamber above the granite box from a parallel example in Djoser's South Tomb, which was recently destroyed. This antechamber had a crossbeam for lowering the plug to seal the space below it. Stadelmann doesn't count portcullises in later pyramids as chambers, and so he justifies this one as a chamber because a few blocks were found with engraved star patterns in the walls. He reasons there must have been a spiritual component to the space, along with the functional closing of the granite box. In comparing this room to the starry sky antechamber of later pyramids, he writes, quote, "Significantly, in these pyramids, the texts describing the king's ascent to heaven are concentrated in the antechamber." End quote. The location of these texts in later antechambers is the best and only evidence-based relationship in Stadelman's paper, so we should highlight it here from the start. Next, the unfinished pyramid of Sekhemkhet is skipped, although with a little imagination, you could reasonably designate 3 chamber areas within it. With the other 3rd Dynasty pyramids also unfinished and poorly documented, we move on to the 4th Dynasty and Pharaoh Snefru's pyramids. The Meidum pyramid seems to have 3 chambers, although the lower 2 are quite small, and we've now abandoned the decorated magazine framework of Djoser's 3rd chamber. But Stadelman doesn't insist the chambers look similar. The sharing of their appearance is entirely optional. His scholarship says the count of 3 is what matters, and so the Meidum pyramid meets that standard. The Red Pyramid clearly has 3 chambers as well, and no doubt this example gave Stadelman confidence with his observation. The other Snefru monument, known as the Bent Pyramid, however, makes counting to 3 a difficult task. This pyramid has a spacious upper chamber and a towering lower chamber, but nothing else that would obviously be designated as a chamber. Stadelman is forced to count the ascending passage as a chamber, perhaps thinking the high corbelled ceiling upgrades its status. No explanation is provided. Perhaps a better choice for a 3rd chamber would have been the Bent Pyramid's chimney. Stadelman notes it lays in the exact center of the structure, similar to the antechambers of later pyramids. In his book on pyramids, Stadelman calls the chimney functionally absolutely pointless, so the tall ascending passage is the only space left for him to count. Next comes everyone's favorite, the Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu. The designated 3 chambers are the King's Chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, and the Subterranean Chamber. But wait a minute, what about the vast space known as the Grand Gallery? It's larger and grander than the Bent Pyramid's ascending passage in every way, but it doesn't count as a chamber? What kind of a counting system is this? We're only at 5 pyramids so far, and we've already bent the rules of counting to 3 in several ways. Stadelman could have simply ignored the subterranean chamber on account of it being unfinished, but he likes the idea of a theologically chthonic component relating to the afterlife. This is a perfect example of how searching for spiritual explanations is often done at the expense of plain observation. Djoser's maneuvering chamber for a plug was designated as a chamber because of some decoration, but Khufu's portcullis chamber has no decorations and thus is not counted by Stadelman. Next up is Khafre, who clearly has only 2 chambers in the pyramid. How does Stadelman turn 2 chambers into 3? By counting the burial chamber as 2 separate chambers because of the layout of the floor. He mistakenly calls this step original, when in fact the floor was originally flat and the limestone pavement removed by Weiss in 1837 while searching for secret tunnels. One could argue the transition from bedrock to limestone floor, where a soft partition may have been embedded in the walls, represents 2 distinct areas. But in doing so, we're now allowed to combine or separate physical spaces into chambers at will and with no logical consistency. All of this in service of counting to 3 for a reason that is never even articulated. However, the crown jewel of logical malpractice within Stadelman's analysis is found next at the Pyramid of Menkaure. The 3 spaces designated as chambers are the spacious upper chamber, the granite burial chamber, and lastly, its adjacent room with 6 small magazines. Menkaure also has a decorated room near the entrance to the pyramid, but Stadelman does not count this as a chamber. Why not? Because of its decorations. He has now added or discarded every architecturally notable feature of a chamber to count it or omit it arbitrarily. There's not a single consistent standard to this 3-chamber system. We can't even claim this type of decoration is disqualifying because the palace facade shows up in later pyramid chambers. We're approaching intellectual dishonesty at this point. It's truly ridiculous. After Menkaure, pyramids become somewhat standardized with the same 4 chamber spaces clearly delineated. The 4 spaces are a chamber with a sarcophagus, an adjacent chamber located in the center of the pyramid, a magazine chamber with a flat ceiling, and a vestibule at the bottom of the descending passage located before the portcullis blocks access to the other chambers. Despite most vestibules being modest in size and conveniently ignored as Stadelmann preferred to do, Menkaure's pyramid clearly establishes them as an important feature of Old Kingdom pyramids. If this room is one of the only ones decorated, it's not an afterthought or insignificant. What makes all the vestibules distinct is that they are the only chamber accessible before further access is blocked by a portcullis. The Pyramid of Userkaf is the best example of this schematic, whereby the magazine chamber is found immediately after the portcullis. The distinction between these 2 apparent storage areas is clearly the physical barrier that obstructs access to the larger space. Egyptology's speculation regarding the vestibules is that they were for a ceremony known as the breaking of the red jars, whereby ceramic offerings were intentionally perforated or smashed in a ritual. Djedkare's pyramid vestibule was found to contain a heap of broken pottery described as fine terracotta, similar in quality to other broken pottery found in its magazine chamber. The reason Egyptology assigns the vestibule for the breaking of the red jars ceremony is that it lacks a better framework to explain why the chamber exists. The classic understanding is that after the pharaoh was buried, the priests would close the portcullis, perform the jar-smashing spell, and then plug up the pyramid's descending corridor. There was no other explanation for having a small chamber in between the pyramid's defensive obstructions. After all, shouldn't the pharaoh's grave goods be left securely beyond the portcullis rather than in front of it? As hopefully most of you are aware, I have proposed a more rigorous model of pyramid security, whereby the portcullis is openable and therefore the inner pyramid is accessible while also secure for a prolonged period of time. This model of pyramid security also allows visitors to enter the pyramid and make offerings without having full access to the inner sanctum. At some point later, the pyramid is fully closed with a granite plug, and this explains the odd location of the vestibule chamber located between 2 obstructions. Notably, the breaking of the red jars spell is found in the burial chamber and is not written in the vestibules where pyramid texts are found. As mentioned before by Stadelmann, the location within pyramids where spells are written is important and contextual. If the breaking of the red jars ceremony is within the burial chamber, it's unlikely to be related to the vestibules. Furthermore, pyramid texts found in vestibules primarily refer to opening a door to the sky. If the adjacent portcullis is understood to be a literal door that can be opened, this makes perfect sense. The earliest pyramid texts, such as this example of Unis, don't have any inscriptions in the vestibule. The inscriptions about opening the door to the sky are written in the corridor here, where the texts first appear within the pyramid. But these spells are moved all the way into the walls of the vestibule when that chamber is first inscribed in the pyramid of Pepi I. This is uncommon for pyramid texts, which tend to stay in approximately the same location from pyramid to pyramid. The simplest explanation for having a vestibule is that some offerings in the pyramid are temporary and others found in the magazine chambers are more permanent. Egyptology has always known temporary offerings were made in adjacent temples, so it's not a stretch to say some could have been made within the pyramids themselves. Menkaure's false door decoration in the vestibule solidifies this connection even further. The whole point of the breaking of the red jars spell is that the offerings aren't usable, so Menkaure wouldn't be receiving them through a false door. If we're going to use spiritual interpretations, they should at least be consistent. Now let's look at the magazine chamber, which is found in every pyramid from Menkaure onwards. These chambers are sometimes called a serdab in Egyptology. which refers to a closed space with a Ka statue or other offerings, but I don't think that's a correct interpretation for pyramids. The magazine chambers are not sealed off. They all have a doorway which shows no signs of being bricked up. Their architecture is somewhat reminiscent of how pyramid temples are designed, with many long, narrow spaces that presumably held sacred objects. At one time, Egyptologists asserted the number of magazines in a pyramid was of spiritual significance. However, now that Sahure's pyramid has been discovered with 8 of them, this idea can be completely discarded. After all, we have pyramids with 2, 3, 6, and now 8 magazines. The pyramid texts leading to this space in the Pyramid of Teti are known as the morning ritual, in which the pharaoh is awoken, fed, and dressed. Sometimes a closet is just a closet and there's nothing else to it. The most significant feature of the magazine chambers is that they are rough and less impressive than all the other rooms. It's as if they were intentionally crafted with less quality to distinguish them from other chambers. Even in the final pyramids of the Old Kingdom, the magazine chamber always has a flat ceiling instead of the gabled saddle vault. In some pyramids, continuing the vault across the magazine chamber might have been easier to build rather than the enormous flat lintels which form their ceiling. But for some reason, it was always important to distinguish the magazine chamber as less than divine. Moving on, the sarcophagus chambers seem self-explanatory. They held the body of a pharaoh, and this was their primary purpose. There's plenty of mystery about whether this was intended to be a permanent stay or a temporary one, and to what degree Egyptians were privileged to enter this space. The pyramid texts are written in what could be described as a call and response style. I propose inscribing them on the walls was because this would be repeated more than one time, rather than only during a funeral. After all, if it's just the pharaoh, who is speaking in third or second person for eternity. Egyptology has never been able to explain why these spiritual writings move from the walls of pyramids to the coffins of the deceased after the fall of the Old Kingdom. The simplest answer is that once pyramids are no longer accessible to visitors, the sacred writings don't need to be displayed prominently. When text is written on a wall, it's meant to be read repeatedly, and when text is hidden inside a coffin, it's only going to be read one time. Finally, let's think about the purpose of an antechamber between the burial chamber and the magazine chamber. A great question to ask is, why bother having an antechamber at all? Would it not be more elegant to have one large chamber rather than separating these spaces? The final Old Kingdom pyramids have the chambers only 1 meter apart. Furthermore, the antechamber's footprint is mostly an intersection of walkway space. It doesn't leave much room for grave goods, which would be relegated to the corners of the chamber. Let's return to Stottleman's point, that the antechamber is where the pyramid texts referring to the pharaoh's ascent to heaven are concentrated. Notably, the antechambers of 5th and 6th Dynasty pyramids are located in the exact center of the monument, directly below the apex. The center of a pyramid is an intuitive place to be spiritually significant. Perhaps this importance is why there is the need to distinguish it from the burial chamber, and we can think of the center of a pyramid as a place of worship. In that context, the early 4th Dynasty pyramid of Snefru with a vertical passage at the center point can be better understood. The so-called chimney in the bent pyramid could also be a location for visitors to worship, rather than an abandoned access tunnel. The so-called antechambers in pyramids of the 4th Dynasty are quite distinct. They are located far away from a burial chamber and are all architecturally unique. But I do see a common thread in some of these chambers, such as the Bent Pyramid, the Great Pyramid, and Menkare's Pyramid, all having a middle chamber with an architectural flair. These chambers were also separated from a burial chamber using obstructions such as a portcullis, making them accessible while still securing the chamber beyond. We can therefore understand that the arrangement of chambers inside a pyramid is closely related to where visitors are allowed to worship and the nature of offerings they give or prayers they incant. Like so many Egyptian temples, there are separate chambers which require varying levels of privilege to worship within. This is something more complex than a tomb, and it bears repeating that a pyramid is not a pointy-shaped mastaba with an ill-considered security system. Finally, in that context of security, there are two pyramids which stand out as having virtually no security at all. The Meidum Pyramid and the Red Pyramid, built by Snefru, contain no portcullises or evidence for plugging of any kind. I've never read an explanation as to how such plugging would be done after the pyramid was completed. In fact, the Great Pyramid being plugged from inside is evidence that no such plugging from the outside could occur after construction was completed at high elevations on a pyramid. Egyptology calls these lower chambers antechambers, but I don't think this is the correct term based upon how we've classified the chambers of later pyramids. The antechambers in the 5th and 6th dynasties are directly connected to a burial chamber, whereas these lower chambers are intentionally disconnected from an upper chamber which doesn't contain a sarcophagus. The antechambers of later 4th dynasty pyramids contain physical barriers between them and a sarcophagus chamber, whereas only a ladder or a rope would be necessary to gain access to the upper chamber in the Meidum and Red pyramids. When you look at all the Old Kingdom pyramids that follow these two, the type of chamber these lower rooms most resemble is in fact the vestibule, a fully accessible space located directly at the bottom of a descending passage. The reason Egyptology has failed to notice the similarity to the vestibule is because these pyramids have two of them instead of one. But as we've established at the start of this video, counting chambers is a terrible way to understand them. Ancient Egyptians didn't care if there were 2, 3, or 4 chambers in a pyramid. They built each chamber according to a purpose, and their architecture helps us understand what those common purposes were. The reason the Meidum and Red Pyramid have upper chambers is to restrict the accessibility of the upper space. It's a security feature for people who are allowed to enter the pyramid, and not a pointless deterrent for thieves who would have already penetrated deep inside it. This height is only an obstacle for visitors who aren't allowed to use a ladder. This demonstrates the lower chambers were designed for people to enter repeatedly, because there is no other reason to separate the upper chamber with such a trivial obstacle to overcome. Once you understand this point, that pyramids accommodated visitors from their earliest designs, the rest of their history makes a lot more sense. Whether it's air channels, liftable portcullises, or pyramid texts talking about opening doors to the sky, the context is all found written in stone. Despite their size, the pyramids are remarkably practical constructions. The ancient Egyptians building them weren't following an arbitrary dogmatic formula. Rather, it is Egyptology which was so dogmatic that it cheated 5 different ways to count to the number 3. The mystery of the pyramids is in how their evolution informs us of their changing role within an ancient society. These marvelous structures are a series of clues that add up to something far greater than the last century of scholarship has ever imagined. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Please subscribe to the channel to see more of this content. Give a like or comment as you see fit, and above all, remember to ask your friends if they take their history for granted.